Hi, this is Maria Williams. Today I have a video for you where I make two cards with the Big Botanicals stamps and dies from the stamp market, and I use a variety of markers and pens to add some gold accents and a pretty good amount of shimmer and shine. Here's a quick look at the two cards I'm going to be duplicating in this video. As you can see, there is a little bit of gold detail on the leaves, as well as a little bit of shimmer and a gold embossed sentiment and some gold stamping. And on this card, there is some silvery outlining and glitter and the same gold accents on the leaves. The main stamps and dies I'm going to be using are the Big Botanicals from the stamp market. And then I'm also going to be using a sentiment from the Oh So Lovely stamps and die set. I posted a card using this set a few weeks ago on my blog if you're interested in looking at that. And then I'm going to be using Citrine and Leafy from the stamp market and some Delicata gold ink, as well as a little bit of washi tape from the stamp market. It's just a really pretty gold dot washi. And then I have a variety of pens and brush pens and all of that I'm going to be using. For the backgrounds of both my cards, I'm going to be using a dark cardstock, which is not something I normally do, so I challenged myself this time. And I'm using navy cardstock from this Color Crush pack from the stamp market that has peach, coral, rusty, and navy cardstocks. I'm using some stitched dies from Lawn Fawn. I believe they're the outside in stitched rectangle dies. I'm also going to be using the squares, and I will have those linked. I'm not sure I got the description exactly right. So I'm just going to trim around the rectangle that I'm going to be using and running it through my Big Shot. And the reason I'm doing this first is because I'm going to stamp the leaves onto this panel with the Delicata ink. And because it's a pigment ink, it takes a little while to dry. So I'm going to do this first and set it aside so that when I'm ready to use it, the ink is nice and dry. I've already set up my stamp in my MISTI, and I've set it up in such a way that I can stamp it off the corner in both of the corners where my die cut leaves are not going to be. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using the Delicata gold ink, and I'm needing to stamp it twice in order to make sure that it's pretty vibrant. So I stamped it one time, it didn't look particularly noticeable, and then I stamped it one more time and you can see how much more vibrant it is. So then I'm just flipping my cardstock over, putting it right back into the corner, making sure it's really nicely into the corner in case I need to stamp it again, inking out my stamp and stamping. This time, because I had already used the stamp and it was already coated with a little bit of ink, I only had to ink it up once and stamp it once. I'm going to set that aside to dry and clean my stamp and my MISTI pad really well. And then I'm going to set up the stamps so that I can stamp two stamps at the same time, and this will make it easier when I'm die cutting as well. I can die cut two of the different leaves at the same time since I'm making two cards that are using the two different leaf clusters. The white cardstock that I'm using to stamp the leaves is from the stamp market. It's their premium white cardstock. So I've just set my two stamps fairly close together so that I can kind of save on paper, but making sure that I'm leaving enough space so that when I die cut, the dies will fit on the cardstock at the same time. I was getting ready to ink up my stamps with citrine ink, and I remembered that the stamp market has changed their ink pads, and I thought I would show you what the difference is. There was some issue with the manufacturer going out of business after their first run. So this is the original pad, and then here is their no-line pad, but all the new pads will be the same. And as you can see, they're a little bit taller, which is great because it'll make it easier to ink your stamps, and they're square, so they'll fit around each other a little bit better as well. So I'm actually happy with the change, just a little bummed that I had already ordered all these colors before the manufacturer went out of business. So I'm going ahead and inking up my stamps really well with the citrine ink and stamping, and I don't know why the paper always sticks to the stamps and moves it out of place. I wish it would just stay put, but even with the magnets I do get a little bit of shifting. So I make sure that everything is lined up again before I ink my stamps up and stamp one more time. So now I've got a nice solid color. And then I'm going to apply a little bit of the second color, which is the leafy ink. I wanted to add a little bit of shading to my leaves, so I'm bringing in the second color, which is leafy, and a small finger sponge dauber. And what I'm doing is just tapping the dauber onto the ink pad to get a little bit of ink on it, and then I'm kind of carefully going around the edges of the leaves. I'm not being super careful. I just don't want to totally cover the leaves with the darker ink. I just kind of want some accents around the edges and mainly around the stems as well. So I'm just very carefully kind of tilting the dauber a little bit and applying ink where I think I need it. And I'm going kind of light because I can always add more, but I can't take away. I apologize for the fact that you cannot see my stamp pad and the fact that I'm tapping the ink, the sponge dauber onto my ink pad, but I was trying. I had the camera a little bit more zoomed in so that when I do the outlining with a gold pen, you could really see it, and I didn't realize how much of my work surface was not visible on the video. I think you get the idea though, and you can definitely see the change in the leaves every time I close a MISTI door and stamp. You can see that the darker ink is added to the image. Once I was happy with my leaves, I took the cardstock out of the MISTI and proceeded to die cut, which is not what I wanted to do because I wanted to do the outlining in gold first. But it's okay. I have one set of leaves that I'm going to outline before die cutting, and then I'll show you how I outlined the ones that I had already die cut. The gold pen that I'm going to use is a gold uniball pen, and it is a 1 millimeter thickness roller ball, and it writes really smoothly. And I'm not sure that you're going to be able to see all the details, but when you're writing with it, occasionally you'll see, especially when you stop, you'll see that it looks like there's a little bit of a puddle of ink, but when it dries, you can't see that at all. So all I'm doing is pretty carefully outlining each one of the leaves, and then I'm drawing one other line down the middle of the leaf, kind of following the curve of the leaf, whichever, either the top or the bottom curve of the leaf, to draw in, yes, I did have to look this up. It is called a midrib. I couldn't think even of the word vein, the veins of the leaf, so I looked it up, and that's actually called the midrib. But anyway, so you don't have to be super careful with this. You just want to follow along the outline, and if you go a little bit outside or inside the line, it is okay. It's not so bright that you're going to immediately notice that there's an error, and it looks great even if it's not perfect. I would advise that if you are going to add some shimmer pen to the leaves with a brush marker or whatever, that you do it before you add the gold on. I did notice that when I added the shimmer pen on top, I actually used a Nuvo Aqua shimmer pen, that it did kind of dull the gold pen a little bit. So do that first if you're going to use it. If you have already die cut your leaves and you want to outline them in gold, what I would suggest is that you take a piece of cardstock that you have die cut the shape out of and just pop your die cut back in before you do the outlining. If you put it into a white die cut area, you may not be able to see where the edges of your die cut are. So what I like to do is to take some cardstock that is a totally different color than my die cut, at least the background. I stamped this onto white cardstock, so the edges of my die cut are white. So I'm just taking a completely different color, popping the die cut in, and if the die cut is not staying in really well, what you can do is flip the cardstock over and then just use some pieces of repositionable tape onto the back and then flip it back over, and it'll stay nicely in place until you are done with all your pen work. Now that all my botanicals are ready to go, I'm taking the two largest squares from the outside in stitched square rectangle set from L'Enfant, and I'm going to die cut the frame. I find it easier to tape the squares together, make sure they're nice and centered before I put them onto my paper and run it through my die cutting machine. I've had a little bit of trouble with these dies cutting through my cardstock in the past, especially when I was doing two dies at one time, so I am using my precision cutting plate. I'm also preparing my card base, which is going to be 4 1/4 by 4 1/4. So it's a piece of cardstock that is 8 1/2 by 4 1/4 that I've scored at 4 1/4 and folded. And then I'm also going to prepare my navy panel, which I'm trimming to 4 1/8 by 4 1/8. So just a little bit smaller than the card, so it doesn't stick out if I get a little off, so it doesn't stick out outside of the card base or the front panel. I'm going to use the Many Thanks stamp from the Big Botanicals stamp set, and then I'm also going to use the die to create a little bit of detail onto the navy panel. So I'm just playing around with all the pieces and setting up the die where I want it and securing it with a couple pieces of tape. Depending on what die cutting machine you have, you will have to adjust your sandwich. But for me, I have the original platform. So I'm opening tab 2 so that I have tab 1 on top. And then I'm putting a regular plate. And then this embossing mat, I believe this one was from Spellbinders. And then I'm placing the cardstock and then my die on top and then a regular plate. I did have to play around with this a little bit. The first time I ran it through, the embossing was really not deep enough, so it wasn't really noticeable. So then I decided to add a couple of pieces of cardstock, and then when I ran that through, the sandwich was a little bit too tight, and so my cardstock just about ripped, and I didn't like that either. So the magic for me was to be on tab 1, one clear plate, the embossing mat, cardstock, the die, another plate, and then one sheet of fairly thick 80-pound cardstock. So again, you'll have to play around with yours, but definitely it won't be whatever setup you're using to cut. That will be too much pressure, so you need to figure out how to reduce the pressure a little bit. For the next step, you could use any kind of pen that you wanted to or a marker with a thin tip and just kind of follow along the impressions made by the die. You could use a white jelly roll pen. I know a lot of people are partial to the Uniball broad tip white gel pen, but I love the jelly roll, and I absolutely love this Stardust jelly roll pen from Sakura. I have had mine for ages and it still works great. Because of the angle of the camera and because I couldn't put my head directly on top of what I was doing, I was having some issues with going outside the lines. So I'm using a mono sand eraser, and because it's glitter, it comes off really, really easily. So you just very lightly just kind of rub it. If you don't have that, you could probably just use the tip of an X-Acto knife or something like that and very carefully remove the glitter. So anyway, I'm just going all the way around, just following the lines. It really is pretty easy. If you've got indentations, the pen kind of wants to stay in there, so it's really easy to do. Next, I'm going to use a clear shimmer brush pen, and I have the Wink of Stella and also the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer, and I tried them both, and the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer was definitely brighter. It stood out more than the Wink of Stella, so that's the one that I went with. So I'm just coating the inside of what I just outlined, and again, this goes very quickly. You've already got the indentations. It's just really quick and easy to do. In the close-up, you can see that some areas look darker than others, but that's just because those areas haven't dried. So the darker areas are wet and the slightly lighter areas are already dry. This is a good time to add the sentiment. So I'm going to take my powder bag and treat my cardstock so that there isn't a lot of static and my powder doesn't stick to places I don't want it to stick to. And then stamp the sentiment with Versamark ink and apply some Ranger Gold embossing powder. Then when my heat tool is nice and hot, I will just go ahead and melt the powder. To begin assembly of the card, I'm going to make sure that my sentiment is right where I want it, and clearly I didn't pay too much attention. I knew I had a little bit of leeway, but I took too much liberty with shifting around the cardstock. I think it might have all gone a little awry when I was doing the dry embossing and putting it through and taking it out. But anyway, it's not a big deal. Right now, my blue panel is sticking out beyond the front frame, but it's not a big deal. I'll trim it out later. So I'm just figuring out the placement of all the botanicals, and I'm going to cut some of the pieces. And my idea is that I want the stems to be hidden behind the frame, but the leaves to have a little bit of dimension. So I'm just like I said, cutting the pieces up and tucking the stems underneath the frame, and then putting a little bit of glue there, but leaving the leaves loose so that I can put some foam tape behind them. I've cut some strips of foam tape in half lengthwise so that they'll fit nicely behind my white frame, and I'm placing those and also some small strips of the foam adhesive onto the backs of some of the leaves. I'm not putting it on every single leaf. I don't think it's really necessary. I think the little pieces I'm placing there will keep everything popped up, and if something gets smushed down, it'll still be okay. It's not going to bend or get damaged in any way. And then I'm going to glue that onto my navy panel, and then take some scissors and trim around some of the excess cardstock, navy cardstock that is sticking out. Once that is done, I'll simply put some glue on the back of the navy cardstock and glue it down onto my white card base. That completes the front of my card, and I'm going to move on to the inside. And I thought I would keep it fairly simple, so I'm using a Wink of Stella gold marker. This is not a brush tip, it's like a marker tip, and it is nice and glittery. So all I'm doing is taking a ruler and using the grid lines on my work surface to draw 3 lines across the bottom of the card, and then I'm just going to take one of the little pieces of botanicals that I trimmed off earlier and didn't use and glue it on top of the lines on one side. For my second card, I'm using a standard A2 card base. So my finished card will be 5.5 by 4.25, and I'm going to apply washi all around the card front. And I didn't want to draw pencil lines that I would then have to erase or worry about covering or showing through the washi tape. So I decided to do score marks instead. So I just placed my card base on my small scoreboard and scored all around the front at 1/2 inch. The other advantage to using score lines instead of pencil lines is that when you open up your card, you've got a little bit of a rectangle detail on the inside. Then I just took my washi tape and followed along the lines, and I thought about trying to trim the washi tape at a 45-degree angle and all of that, but the dots are random, so they're not going to line up perfectly regardless. So I just took the easy way out, which I think looks just fine, and just overlapped the washi tape on all 4 corners. I'm using the Oh So Lovely sentiment from the Oh So Lovely stamp and die set from the Stamp Market. So I have my sentiment in my MISTI, and I put a piece of cardstock into my MISTI. I have these adhesive sheets in it, so I don't need magnets or anything. And then I treated the cardstock with my anti-static pouch, inked my stamp with Versamark ink, and then just sprinkled my gold embossing powder and heat embossed it. I really like the font of this sentiment, and I love that it has a coordinating die with it so that you can create an interesting shape with it. I'm starting the card assembly with my navy panel, so I'm just putting some foam tape. This one is from scrapbook.com. Putting that onto the back of the panel, and I will attach that, and then I'm going to attach the botanicals with some Nuvo Deluxe adhesive glue. And at this point I decided I wanted these leaves to be shimmery, so that's when I used the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen. I wish I had done that earlier before I did the gold, but it still looks okay here. It just dulls the gold a little bit. Then I just took a little bit more of the foam tape, cut some small strips to go behind the Oh So Lovely sentiment, and attach the sentiment to the center of the card. If you wanted to add a little bit more gold to the front of this card, you could have die cut the botanical shape out of some gold foil cardstock and put it below your green die cut, and that way you would have been able to see a little bit of a gold border. Or you could have also cut it out of vellum and then used your Wink of Stella gold brush marker. It makes it really, really shimmery. It's really, really pretty. I'm going to use this on the inside of my card. So I'm just going to use the same washi tape that I used on the front of the card, but I'm not going to go all the way around. I'm just going to put it on two sides of the inside of the card, and then I'm going to glue the vellum piece in the other corner. And I decided to just use a little bit of glue. I figured the gold shimmer would kind of hide the adhesive. I think in the end you can kind of see it a little bit, but I don't think anybody will notice. It just made the die cut a little bit darker where the glue was behind it. And I also wish I'd left a little bit more of the leaves visible, but it still looks good. So that finishes my second card, and we are coming to the end of the video. I hope that I have given you some ideas for how to use your glitter and metallic pens, and I hope you will give this a try on your next card project. Here's another quick look at both of the cards. If you like this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and I always love getting comments from you. Have a great day, and see you next time. For links to the products I used and still shots, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.